Fur pom-poms are a fun finish for hats, but sometimes they pop off when the weather is rough or they're worn for hard play. So here's a solution. Let's include knitting the pom-pom right along with knitting the hat. The version that we're knitting today fits American Girl dolls. The doll version of this pattern is in this book, and I'll put a link in the program notes. There's a human version too, and it's in my Fun with Fur book. Today we're knitting the mid-gauge version, which needs to get a gauge of 5.5 stitches, 8 rows per inch. And I am using leftovers of Mary Lou's Liberty Plus a Mary Maxim self-striping yarn. Working on my KX 350, stitch size 4 gets this gauge, and you need number 3, otherwise known as DK weight yarns. Also needed is a very small amount of Lion Brand Fun Fur yarn, and Lion Brand is a superior one for use on the knitting machine because it has a strong central core and medium length eyelashes. Some similar looking yarns have thicker or more fragile cores or longer lashes or slubby fuzzy spots, all of which make it very difficult for the machine. So you want a yarn that either is this or is much like it. Cast on across a span of 56 needles. Really, you may use any neat cast on, but here's how I like to begin this hem. I E-wrapped every other needle, then hung the comb, brought all the needles forward so they would immediately begin to knit, set the carriage to knit back from hold, and then started knitting. Hem is knitted at main stitch size minus 1 whole number, so for me that is 3, and the hem is worked for 20 rows. I changed colors between the hem and the main hat because I'm trying to stretch my supply of self-patterning yarn, but that is optional. Now we hang the E-wraps to close the hem. Since I only E-wrapped every other needle to start with, I only have to hang every other E-wrap. One of the reasons I like to do this, especially for small size garments like this one, is that it makes the area where the hem is hung a little less bulky and noticeable. But either way, hang your cast on to close the hem. Afterwards, I always bring the needles all the way forward to knit back from hold because it makes that first row easier to knit. Rehang the comb. Turn up the carriage to the main stitch size, for me that's number 4, and change yarn if you're planning to do so. And for the doll hat, we'll knit 20 rows. Now snip the working yarn, leaving a tail as long as twice the width of the working needles. Thread that tail into a yarn needle and begin working it through every stitch. Sometimes when we do this, we're also lifting the stitches off of the machine at this time. We are not doing that here. Leave them on the machine. I do think it helps to leave the comb on the work for this section. That little bit of downward pull keeps the stitches from jumping off the needles, which we really don't want them to do till we're ready. You may also notice that my yarn needle is immense. That's because it's actually an upholstery needle, and while it is not essential to have one, it is a help. Work across until all of the stitches are on the gathering thread, but we won't gather it yet. Just drop the needle down at the left side of the machine. At this point, we are going to dispense with the edge needles, so just leave the center 43 needles in work. And since all the stitches are already on the yarn tail that we threaded through them, you can just drop those to the left and right of the center 43. Now we transfer stitches. We want to end up with every third needle in work. So we'll transfer stitch number 2 to the left, stitch number 3 to the right, and then place needles 2 and 3 out of work. Stitch number 4 will receive the next stitch over and then work across in this manner, making a 2 needle space between each working needle. There will be 2 empty needles, then a working needle, and most of the working needles will actually have 3 stitches on them. Do this all the way across the work. The goal is to end up with 14 needles still holding stitches and still in work, And between each of those 14, 2 needles are out of work. Turn the stitch size up as far as it will go. Thread the fun fur into the carriage, and we'll just knit 12 rows. If the carriage is not happy about knitting that first row, and it may not be because the stitches get pretty darn tight when we transfer them both left and right, knit the first row manually by placing the yarn in the needle hook and pulling back. Then thread the carriage and knit the remaining 11 rows, and it'll go just fine. On the KX 350 at this spacing, the fun fur yarn gave me no trouble whatsoever. Sometimes on gate pegs, it will tend to hang up a little bit more, and you can give a tug downward after knitting every row to make that go better. I skipped the tension mast and hand fed those few rows. You may use the tension mast, but sometimes it's a little bit too tight. The yarn supply was near my feet. I hold my hand above the carriage and just let the yarn slide through my fingers. I'll cover machine knitting with furry yarns in another video in more detail. Now leave about a 24-inch yarn tail and snip the yarn. Place the end in a yarn needle, and this time we're going to lift all the furry yarn stitches off as we go if you want to, because we are gathering the end of the pom-pom. So the knitting is finished. We just need to do some hand finishing. Gather in the very top with the fun fur yarn tail, pull it in tightly, and make a knot so that it can't come undone. The fun fur is sturdy enough to close the top of the pom-pom securely. Also draw in the main yarn strand that we ran through the work, and that closes the top of the hat. It also should be knotted securely. I'm a great believer in using real knots here because we can tuck all those ends in the pom-pom. They don't have to show, and we truly need this to be secure. The whole thing will fall apart. The furry yarn tail is still at the very top of the hat. Take it and stitch through so it's pushing the top of the pom-pom down to the gathered crown of the main portion of the hat, and then knot it and snip off the extra tails. Make sure to give the hung hem a good lengthwise pull to set the stitches. It'll look much nicer after you do. And then you must fluff and fluff and fluff, pluck with your fingers and or comb to get the pom-pom to its maximum fluffy best self. Now sew the edges of the work together and the hat is basically done. A couple of details that may interest you. This is what the interior of the hem looks like the way I did it. As mentioned, it's perfectly okay to cast on in your own favorite way. This is how far the drawstring in this area tends to naturally pull in. And while that's fine for a doll, I would recommend stitching across that O to pull it in more tightly to be more secure and warmer for human wear.